Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in to this extremely timely panel, America Votes, Transatlantic Trendlines in the Midterm Elections. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. I just got back from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I was watching the election up close in one of the United States' key swing states. And I can tell you, Americans on both sides of the aisle were fired up and ready to head to the polls. And indeed, we saw record turnout this week. While the red wave that many predicted didn't necessarily come to fruition, Republicans did see gains in the House. We're waiting to hear about the outcome for the Senate, but all in all, pretty good night for President Joe Biden and the Democratic Party writ large. So for us at the Atlantic Council, now it's time to talk about what this means for Joe Biden and his foreign policy agenda. And more specifically, what does it mean for the transatlantic relationship, for the ongoing support of Ukraine and rebuilding the relationship with Europe, which has been a key tenet of President Biden's foreign policy agenda for the last 2 years. So to discuss all of these issues and more today, I am thrilled to welcome this esteemed panel consisting of Ambassador Daniel Fried, the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, who is joining us from the West Coast where it just hit 6 a.m. So maybe if we're lucky, we'll get to watch the sun come up while you're sitting in your car, Ambassador Fried. We also have Vivian Salama, who is a national security reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and Tyson Barker, who's joining us from Berlin. I think you're in Berlin right now, Tyson, who's the head of the Technology and Global Affairs program at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and of course, a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. So welcome all of you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules today to join us. If you're tuning in online for our audience, please be sure to submit your questions in the chat function. We do want this to be an interactive conversation. So if you have questions, just send them in through the, not the chat function, the Q&A function, I'm sorry, use the Q&A function. And I'll be sure to watch that during the next hour so we can integrate your questions into the conversation. So with that, let's go ahead and dig right in. Vivian, I'm going to turn right to you. Can you give us just a play-by-play of what we just saw in the midterms? Like I mentioned in my opening remarks, doesn't necessarily seem like the red wave people were expecting came to fruition. What were the Democrats expecting, and how should we be reading this outcome for the next 2 years of Biden's presidency?
Rachel, it's great to see you and great to be with all of you. So, right, the red wave that a lot of people were expecting did not happen. In the words of Lindsey Graham, who was Senator Lindsey Graham, who was giving an interview after the polls closed, he said, "That's for darn sure. It did not happen as so many observers and so many polls were expecting." That being said, control for Congress is still up in the air. We're about 36 hours out from most of the polls closing, and both the House and the Senate races continue. Vote counting continues to be in several states. The Senate race in Georgia, one of the really critical races that everyone's watching over potential control of the Senate, that's going to a runoff. Nevada still remains up in the air for the Senate. Alaska still unsettled, although we know Alaska is going to a Republican candidate ultimately. And so, a lot going on there. Obviously, many viewers will know that control of the Senate was split 50-50, and Vice President Kamala Harris was the tiebreaker in this last chamber. And so we'll see how it goes in the coming year. And then the House, of course, was where a lot of observers believed that Republicans were going to really make a sweep. And even though it's not settled, that sweep just did not happen. As of right now, the latest numbers show that Republicans have made some gains, and they're definitely ahead. The likelihood of Republicans taking the House right now is high. but it's almost inevitable, but not by the vast margins that were expected. And so obviously that starts to raise questions. These midterm elections are often viewed as a referendum, right? A referendum on the president who's in office. And usually when we are at a midterm election, the party of the president loses control of at least one chamber. It's always, it's easier to vote against something than vote for it in continuity and say that you don't want anything to change. And so oftentimes you do see a loss of at least one chamber of Congress in a midterm election. President Biden's approval rating hovers at about 42% at the moment, which is relatively low. And so, there's a lot of questions, though, about whether or not the Democrats either were able to mobilize certain demographics in a way that helped them to hang on to a couple of seats. There's also questions about the opposition, if you will, particularly former President Donald Trump, who continues to be a major figure in the Republican Party. He campaigned heavily for a number of these candidates, several of whom lost, and we already know that they lost. The Georgia race is one that is definitely looked at very closely because he was very involved in that one. But other races like in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, Arizona, you're seeing that the candidates that he strongly backed did not win. And all this comes as he has been teasing all week that he has a very, very, very big announcement coming. He just said last night that he has potentially the biggest announcement in the history of the United States that he's going to make in a couple of days. So we'll see if that's the case, but it's seeming more likely that he is going to run. And whether or not the fact that the Republican Party did not make the significant gains that they hoped for, a lot of people now saying, is that due to the fact that Donald Trump was so heavily involved? Is this a sign that he shouldn't be running? And so many themes coming out of it because of the results that we already have in our hands from Tuesday night.
Super fascinating. That was a great overview of what we've been seeing this week. And, for us at the Atlantic Council, I think what we're thinking about now and what we have been thinking about for the last few months really is, what is the outcome of this midterm election going to mean for Biden's foreign policy agenda? We know that voters don't usually vote on foreign policy. It's not what drives people to the polls, but it has been such a huge issue for the last year, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This has been at the forefront of everyone's mind. And it seems like right now, the bigger issue at least with the Republicans, might be this sort of like Trumpist versus center-right divide, which might also mean that the GOP is sort of too tangled up in its own confusion right now to focus too much on foreign policy and on stymieing the president's agenda going forward. So with that, Ambassador Fried, I wanted to turn to you. What does this outcome mean for Biden's foreign policy agenda more broadly?
You're right, Rachel, that the Republicans themselves are split on foreign policy and on strategy. The way I'd put it is, you have the Reaganite tradition versus the rising, you could call it neo-isolationist, but that really doesn't quite do it justice. Trump and his group do not believe in America's leadership of the free world. They don't believe in the free world. Trump, in fact, sides with the other. He's on the other side. He's on Putin's side, and so are a lot of his most fervent supporters. I'm thinking of Tucker Carlson from the Fox News commentator. They actually believe in an American foreign policy which is transactional, which tends to favor dictators with whom you can do deals. And as I said, they like Putin. They don't like Europe. They don't like America's alliances. This is a return to isolationism of the late 1930s and pre-Pearl Harbor. But let's remember that the isolationists were indifferent to whether Hitler ruled in Europe. And a lot of them felt it really wasn't our fight. They were hostile to the West European powers. And Trump has revived this tradition. It's ugly. That's the bad news. And that tradition is not going away. If, in fact, Trump announces his candidacy for president, he's going to comment on foreign affairs. And that'll put strains on the Republican Party. Okay, that's the bad news. The good news is that the Reaganites still seem to be the majority in at least elected members of Congress. And if they want, they may well go after Biden for not being tough enough, for not giving enough help to the Ukrainians. So, yeah, you're right. The Republicans are going to be split. However, it doesn't mean they're going to be too tangled in their own mess to make trouble for the Biden administration. Yeah, I wish. They're going to look for areas to push back, and burden sharing, so-called, that is demanding that the allies do more. They may go after Germany. Trump did. Germany has made a lot of mistakes. They have a lot to answer for basically decades of bad assumptions about Russia, but they are, my view, Germany's trying to come along. They are moving in the right direction. It's not pretty to watch, but it's real. It's happening. Kind of the screams of anguish you hear, the screams that result from discarding decades of bad assumptions about Russia and coming up with new positions. But the Republicans are likely to pound on burden sharing issues. They're likely to push the Biden administration. Also, let's not forget, there is a part of the hard left in the Democratic Party which doesn't believe in supporting Ukraine. It's either a sense that this isn't our fight, or there are other more important issues, and maybe some lingering sense that we oughtn't to be tough on Moscow. But the bad letter last week from the Progressive Caucus that got pulled within 24 hours shows that even the hard left is divided, with a lot of them staunchly for Ukraine and for the right reasons, because they see Ukraine as a democracy being attacked by a dictator. So I think the Democrats are going to be solid. I think the Republicans are going to be split. I think that they will make trouble for the Biden administration, but it's trouble the administration has to expect and needs to deal with. Burden sharing issues, of course. There's a deeper issue, though, that this election doesn't resolve, which is that there has always in the United States been an ambivalence about our leadership role in the world. That's not new. Trump didn't make that up. I'm thinking of J.D. Vance, right? Who said, well, but what's our interest in Ukraine? Why do I care? Why do my constituents care? My people care? And after 20 years of post 9/11 wars, which didn't turn out so well, there is certainly a weariness about international engagement and U.S. military engagement, which is one of the reasons the Biden administration and President Biden personally has been so determined to keep American forces out of the fight in Ukraine, which he's done. That's his line. So the issue of making the case to the American people why American leadership is not idealism or charity or, the foreign policy blob, but is actually in America's interest, is something that this administration and all administrations need to do. It can be done, but they will need to keep making the case.
Absolutely. That was a great overview. I was really surprised because I really thought over the last few months that the ongoing support for the U.S. of Ukraine, both militarily in terms of weapons and financially, was going to become a more salient issue for at least the right in the midterms. And I feel like that didn't happen as deeply as I thought it would. Did that surprise you at all, Ambassador Freed? Like, were you expecting Ukraine to be a much more loud talking point? And did that meet your expectations?
Well, remember, Ukraine is winning.
Yeah.
They are an embattled democracy fighting off a much stronger, or what seemed to be a much stronger country. They're doing well. And so, look, Americans look at this fight, and you're helping people fight for their lives. You're not helping people who don't care or are indifferent or are divided. The Ukrainians are all in and they are winning. And that's a pretty good story.
Yeah.
This is during the Cold War. American strategy didn't work out always so well, like in Southeast Asia or the Middle East. But in Europe, where countries actually believed in democracy and wanted to resist Moscow, it worked out pretty well. It worked out very well in the end. And so this is a good story. And that's something to build on, which is why I suspect it didn't become more of an issue. It's not American troops aren't in Ukraine. American weapons are. And, all through the country, there is support for Ukraine. It's not just, in Washington and in San Francisco where there are Ukrainian flags. All through the United States, people care about this issue. So there is the other side to the weariness, the sense of ambivalence about America's role in the world. There is also pride at, frankly, being on, helping the good guys when the good guys are winning. So there's, this is politics, right? I'm not an expert on domestic politics, but I spent a lot of my career dealing with other countries' politics. When you have a good story or a potentially good story that fits your best narrative about yourself, which is somewhat the case in Ukraine, right? America is the leader of the free world. And here's a country wants to be part of our world and is fighting for its life and doing okay. That story has traction. So there is a challenge to the Biden administration, themes about leading the free world, and Ukraine is part of that fight. But there's also a lot of foundation for them to be able to keep making the case.
Rachel, I just want to add really quickly a point to the ambassador's comments, which is that, I did the Wall Street Journal's poll last week about where the Ukraine war ranks, and I called around to voters. And yes, it is an issue, and it's definitely divided along partisan lines, where a lot of Republicans are starting to sour toward these indefinite aid packages to Ukraine. But remember, in the vast scheme of things, it ranks pretty low for a lot of Americans because of the fact that the Ukraine war for so many Americans is a bit of a pie in the sky. It's far away, they are disconnected from it, and they have mounting inflation to deal with, rising cost of, everything from food to gas. Just getting through life, day-to-day life, feeding their families is right now a challenge, and we are going into a year that could potentially pose a recession here in the United States. And so that ranks so much higher for so many Americans that even the Democrats that I spoke to, they said, yes, we do support continued aid packages to Ukraine, but not at our expense. And I think you're going to see that debate more and more, particularly when it comes to economic aid. Perhaps not so much military aid, but economic aid is going to be something that will be debated. It just did not make the top headlines because of all the other issues that were ranking highly in this election.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the Biden administration is going to have to make some complicated policy decisions, especially since the U.S. and other Western countries are sitting on, a certain amount of lockdown Russian foreign exchange reserves. And there'll be some pressure to use that rather than asking American taxpayers to keep sending money.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too. And Tyson, I might turn to you to see how the Europeans are sort of thinking about U.S. support for Ukraine before we dive into a broader Europe conversation. But Ambassador Fried, you made an interesting point earlier about this letter that was released last week by the Progressive Caucus that basically talked about the need for making sure negotiations are still on the table. And then they walked it back, saying that the letter was supposed to be written a few months ago and it was released on accident, and really sort of put the progressives in a bind. Even, Senator Bernie Sanders came out against the letter. And so I think what's interesting for the Biden administration is that you wonder if there's going to be a point where he gets sort of squeezed from both sides, squeezed from the progressive wing of his party, but also squeezed from the Republicans as well. And the longer that this war in Ukraine goes on, even if the Ukrainians are winning, which I indeed think they are, especially with the Russians retreating from Kherson yesterday, I just wonder where this conversation is going to go. Tyson, are the Europeans, talking about continued U.S. support for Ukraine in still in a deeply meaningful way? Because, I really don't think that we would have seen the transatlantic unity on things like military support in terms of weapons, financial support, a multilateral sanctions regime, if it wasn't for the leadership role of the United States here.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, interest in this election in Europe is really high. I think sometimes that a lot of Europeans see the United States as its kind of second political home. Their second political home, and they watch U.S. politics as closely as they watch their own domestic politics. And they have, of course, their rooting interests in U.S. politics. I'm sitting here in Berlin, and I've been doing a lot of speaking in the past 2 weeks across Germany and listening to what they are honing in on. And one of the things that they, of course, were honing in on were the statements by Kevin McCarthy on the question of the blank check to Ukraine. And that has definitely resonated both at the elite level and at the popular level. And I think that there is a kind of built-in expectation and comfort level. I mean, of course, they have a lot of Europeans, Germans especially, but Europeans across the board have opinions about U.S. politics in all sorts of ways, but particularly on Ukraine, I think that there is the sense that the U.S. still provides a very steady hand, a kind of force around which to coalesce for a united position vis-a-vis Ukraine. That's clear in the level of financial support, economic support, fiscal support, and of course military support that we've seen, which is, it's orders of magnitude different because of the United States capabilities. But the idea that might be constrained by Republican control of the House anyway is worrying in Europe. And there is starting to be thinking about, okay, if that does become constrained, how do we have to react to that? And, I think that will lead to a little more urgency in debates about how to shore up, Ukrainian economic stability. We saw that Ursula von der Leyen and Olaf Scholz had on October 25th a recovery summit here in Berlin. But we all know that the financial assistance that has been pledged by Europe is not being deployed as rapidly as any of us would expect or hope. So I think that there's going to be a little bit of a realization. Now, of course, the results of the election itself are still being parsed, not just in the United States, but across the world, including here in Europe. So I think people are still considering, okay, well, what does this mean for the US position in Europe? There's also a great awareness here, and we can talk about the economic stuff, which, is also quite important for the US-European relationship, aside from Ukraine and also China. But there is a sense that, the Biden administration is the most Atlanticist administration that we have in living memory, probably since the Cold War. And, that there's a real sense that maybe that was taken a little bit for granted. Maybe there is a need to complement that because, as Biden and his team continually say, you have to link foreign policy to the domestic concerns of average citizens. And, sometimes that has not been something on the minds of planners in European capitals necessarily. And on that note, I mean, we can talk about maybe in a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act and its impacts here in Europe, which has become a sense of tension, a source of tension. And of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, it has provisions in it that are meant to stimulate domestic development of green technology in the United States that will pull production capacity out of US allied countries, including Europe, but also countries like South Korea. And that has become a big sticking point. And let's be honest, who are the people who negotiated the Inflation Reduction Act? It wasn't the Republicans. It was, Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin, two Democrats. So, these issues aren't necessarily they're pretty complex. There are going to be tensions, even with a perhaps Democratic Senate majority. And there's going to be a lot of issues to impact, not just with regard to Ukraine, but some of the geoeconomics, the tech, and the China issues as well.
Yeah, and Tyson, I wanted to dig in on that a little bit more on the tech issues, because that's sort of what you focus on in your position at DGAP. The Trade and Technology Council, the US EU Trade and Technology Council, has been sort of this forum to discuss like tech regulations, how the two sides can work with each other as we head into this sort of unknown space in terms of technology. I think there's discussions on stuff like competition. Do you see that like bearing fruit over the next couple of years? I don't necessarily think that like the outcome of these talks on technology were dependent upon the outcome of the midterms. But I'm wondering how you're thinking about that and how you're looking at it.
Yeah, a couple points on that. First of all, this stuff is hard stuff. This is not easy stuff, and sometimes it's below the radar stuff. It's very difficult to communicate this to publics. But if you look at, for example, the U.S. national security strategy, which was released a couple of weeks ago, it is clear that the U.S. approach to its partners in the world, both in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, is shifting towards much more focus on geotech and geoeconomic issues in flexible arrangements like the TTC, the Quad, and IPEF. So this is kind of, if you're thinking about kind of grand strategy and how the U.S. is trying to create connective tissue with partners, this is kind of one of the models that is being used. Now, it's hard to get the expectations right for something like the Trade and Technology Council, because what they've tried to do, and the Trade and Technology Council is a minister level or secretary level body that has the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of State, and the U.S. Trade Representative on the U.S. side, also coordinated by the White House, and two executive vice presidents from the European Commission. And they meet twice a year to try to move the ball on, some issues that kind of sit at the nexus of geopolitics and tech and economics. And it was a very important body, frankly, for compressing the time necessary to implement, foreign direct product rule and other sanctions around technology on Russia in the aftermath of its invasion of Ukraine, or its latest wave of invasion of Ukraine, because of course Russia has been there for 8 years. But, as we're moving forward, there continue to arise new irritants, new challenges. The tax credit for electric vehicles is one of them. There's also the issue of global corporate tax, the OECD deal. There are some big questions as to whether or not the United States is actually going to be able to implement it. There are some big ideas, big projects that are kind of in the works right now for the next TTC meeting, what they call TTC 3, which is supposed to take place in December 5th, which I think is the day before the runoff in Georgia.
Yeah.
But it's putting points on the board at the kind of below the front page level. So just to give you a couple of examples, the election at the ITU, at the International Telecommunications Union, which is the oldest UN body. It's the body that's responsible for governing. It used to be the telegraph, and now it's for telcos and creating standards in telcos. The US and Europe closed ranks and supported each other's candidates for the Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General, and were able to get wins for both. And that's a very important body for shaping internet governance, for example. They are thinking right now about how to latch up on joint financing for ICT projects in the Global South. And there's some talks about real concrete projects in smart cities and data centers and broadband in Jamaica and Kenya. So some good things happening. They have an idea. They've already listed a set of principles for trustworthiness, for ICT that will exclude vendors from Huawei and ZTE. So they're making progress. And then there's also the kind of what I would call the TTC ecosystem. So a lot of breakthroughs and agreements happening outside the TTC on things like the free flow of data between the United States and Europe. So it's making progress, but this is all progress that's real wonky, real nerdy, and hard to communicate. And that's where it gets a little difficult. The other thing is that a lot of the irritants that are emerging, like through the Inflation Reduction Act, or on the European side through things like the Data Act, are actually products of the domestic legislation processes themselves. Yeah. So we still haven't figured out a way to coordinate, and these are sovereign blocks, so you can't really do that. They have elected officials that are governing on behalf of their citizens. But we still haven't figured out a way to kind of coordinate to make sure that those irritants don't arise through independent legislative processes.
Yeah, super fascinating stuff. We could do a whole other event on just talking about the TTC, and perhaps we will. And I think actually we just did a couple days ago. I wanted to broaden the aperture a little bit before we come back, and I'm of course going to ask specifically about Germany because that's one of my favorite countries to work on. It's so fascinating. But Vivian, I wanted to ask you, as a national security reporter, the Biden administration just released this national security strategy, and one of the key goals of the Biden administration the last couple of years has been to repair this relationship with Europe that was so deeply damaged during the Trump presidency. But when you look at the national security strategy, it's very clear that this administration is focusing more on the Indo-Pacific and China, which, given the midterms, given that there is a hawkish element both in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party as well toward China, I wonder what that means for the continued focus on Europe and European security. The announcement in June, for example, that we were going to send permanent presence to Poland, announcing that at the NATO Madrid summit. So I'm wondering, how you think the midterm elections are going to affect Biden's national security strategy, if at all, if it will make it easier for him to sort of complete or at least continue this rebalance to the Indo-Pacific region, and whether or not that will come at the expense of Europe.
So a lot to unpack there, but it's really interesting, sort of going back to my days of covering the Trump White House, where he was rolling out these very tough tariffs, not only on China, but also on steel and aluminum in Europe and other areas. And the world reacted and said, this is outrageous. How could he do this? We don't do that to our allies. It's not the right approach. Democrats in particular used it as a point of contention. And yet when President Biden came in, particularly when it came to China, he did not roll back those tariffs. And so you started to see an interesting continuity between parties on this hawkish policy of competition toward China, but also this intense desire to work with China, get a trade deal together, engage on security matters and other areas. And so when the Russia conflict began, the latest, I should say, invasion of Ukraine began, a few European officials who I speak to European officials constantly as part of my job, and one in particular told me that the sense that they get from the White House is that they see this conflict as a bit of a sideshow to what they really want to accomplish, which is a greater presence in the Indo-Pacific, intensified competition with China, in all areas, everything from trade protection to security and whatever you name it. And no one really expects that will change dramatically with a flipping of either chamber of Congress. What will be interesting is whether or not you kind of throw the kitchen sink at Indo-Pacific issues versus this forced balance that we've seen in the last year, this juggling, if you will, of European issues and of Indo-Pacific. Yes, the Biden administration came in and they said, we are going to repair our relationship with Europe and particularly sort of reaffirm our commitment to NATO, something that was of great concern to our European allies during the Trump era, just because of a lot of his public rhetoric. Although, you talk to a lot of his aides at the time, and they sounded a lot more, in line with what you hear from the current administration in terms of the importance of the alliance, et cetera. But there was this concern that they had been abandoned, and then Biden came in and was going to embrace Europe, embrace NATO, and kind of restore that friendship. And he has done so to a large extent, but by necessity, not by kind of priority. The priority continues for the administration to be Indo-Pacific, and they do want to put all their resources into it. And I think you're going to see, regardless of the outcome of the election, that sense sort of resonating. I think if anything, it's going to even push it forward. There is a little bit of wavering within the Republican Party, although I wouldn't say the majority, but the Republicans in Congress, as we've been saying, about whether or not to continue this enormous consistent aid packages to Ukraine. And you're going to start to see kind of questioning in Congress on that. That may shift the priority and the focus a little bit more toward Indo-Pacific. But for as long as President Biden is in the White House, I think you're going to continue to see this push for this balance, again, out of necessity, on European issues and the Indo-Pacific. The question now is, if Donald Trump or someone as hawkish as he was, it runs and wins election in 2024, whether or not we see a flip. And I think that's really what's dominating concerns among European allies, is this lack of consistency. When you have the kind of back and forth, obviously, this is the way things work in the United States. Every 4 years we have an election. Sometimes the leadership changes, and with that comes changes in policy. But I don't think in Europe in particular, we saw such an abrupt change, especially in public rhetoric, as we did during the Trump era. And the fact that he kind of looms in the background and could potentially come back, it's that lack of consistency on Europe issues, and also this kind of consistent focus on Indo-Pacific issues that makes some of the European allies a little wary.
Absolutely. And you made a really good point, because I remember there was this moment during the Trump presidency where I think it was Secretary Mike Pompeo. He was at the UN and they were talking about implementing these snapback sanctions on Iran regarding the JCPOA. And he said something along the lines of, remember, you didn't negotiate with the United States, you negotiated with the Obama administration. And if that's our approach to things, then of course the Europeans are going to be wary if there's such a swing between different administrations. Ambassador Fried, I'd like to come to you. You mentioned earlier, and this was regarding Ukraine, but you said, when you have a good story to tell about yourself, that story has traction. Do the Europeans have a good story to tell about themselves to keep the United States focused on them rather than on the Indo-Pacific, or can they do both? You hear a lot from high-level administration officials, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. To me, that sort of seems like a rhetorical dodge a little bit. But how are you thinking about it?
I'm thinking that American administrations for the past 25 years have thought of Asia as the future, Europe as the past, and they usually discover their mistake after they get stupid and get burnt. The fact is, the Biden administration wanted to park relations with Russia in a stable and predictable place, their phrase, so they could concentrate on Asia. Yeah, okay, that's nice. Knock yourselves out. You can't ignore Putin. He, as the national security strategy points out, he's the more dangerous aggressor in the immediate term. China is the more profound challenge. And this is something Tyson was getting at, and he's absolutely right. You can't deal with China without Europe. Okay, just, repeat that everybody in the administration should repeat that 3 times daily. You need Europe to handle the rise of China. And I think the Biden administration gets it. I mean, the Trade and Technology Council, all that uber wonky stuff that Tyson was talking about, that's really important. That means we're getting our act together to be able to deal with China's gaming and exploitation of the international system that has given them so much and from which they've taken so much. Now, what does this have to do with the election? Well, I think that there is more continuity between Republicans and Democrats on some of these issues than meets the eye. Not Trump. Trump couldn't maintain a consistent policy. He couldn't maintain even his own policy, right? He's tough on Korea and then he's soft on Korea. He wants to be tough on China, but he's fighting with Europe, which is the best way to deal with China. But put aside Donald Trump. Nobody's mentioned Ron DeSantis. I'm not, it's Vivian is the political expert on the US, not me. But if he is the rising figure to challenge Donald Trump, are his views more Reaganite or Trumpite? And I think there is at least an argument to be made that in foreign affairs, he'll be more Reaganite. He'll make trouble for the Biden administration, but his approach might overlap with some of their actual approach. That is pushing back on China, and the Biden administration has done a lot. I mean, that big move on chips and technology to China, one of the few wonky things that Tyson didn't mention, so I get to. That's hawkish. That's tough stuff. I think a lot of Republicans would support that. I think a lot of Republicans would support the Inflation Reduction Act provisions that have the Europeans so upset, which is the preferences for manufacturing in the United States. Now, the Biden administration is going to talk a good game with Europe, but if we are fighting a trade war with Europe over industrial production, we're going to have a problem. So the Biden administration is going to have to work this out. But my point, to bring this back to our ostensible topic, which is the elections, is below the level of rhetoric, there are often ways for the parties to work together on a common agenda if you don't talk too much about it in public. And I think that this is going to be possible. The challenge for the Biden administration will be to put together its foreign policy for the middle class, which I guess means reshoring industrial production back to the US. And put that together with our outreach to Europe, because we're going to need them to deal with the Chinese, who are far more of a problem for American manufacturing. Now we're getting to the area of real policy as opposed to partisan politics. And I think as always, in the next 2 years, there will be the pull of partisanship and sloganeering at some level, and then the underlying challenge of putting together deals and framing issues in ways that bring the parties together. Even in the last 2 years, it could be done on some of the things, like the Inflation Reduction Act. So, more power to them. But I think that things can happen in the next 2 years, and the fault lines and the tensions will be along the lines we've been discussing. How do you work with Europe? How do you deal with burden sharing? How do you arrange a kind of free world consensus for a common China policy? Anyway, all of that is going to keep us busy. But the elections, and this is Vivian's point, absolutely right. If they were a blowout catastrophe for the Democrats, the Republicans might be seeing blood, and that kind of the kind of careful work I'm talking about might be less possible. They're likely to pick up the House. They may get the Senate, but it won't be by much. And so the kind of cross-cutting deals may become the way to go. I hope so.
Yeah.
Can I just jump on one of those points? Because Dan mentioned Ron DeSantis. And I think, if you do look for a red wave, and I'm a little bit of a political junkie, it was in Florida. But if you look across the map in places like, contest in Georgia with Brad Raffensperger, with the governor there, if you look at Mike DeWine in Ohio, all the people who have emancipated themselves from the kind of Trump ideology overperformed by and large. I mean, these people all won their elections by a great margin. So there's a lot of leadership within the Republican Party that isn't necessarily as beholden to Trump. And once they have emancipated themselves, they tend to be rewarded by the voting public. So, that's definitely a dynamic to watch. I would say, though, that with DeSantis, although we can watch him and see where his worldview develops, he has shown some affinity to Viktor Orban and Fidesz in the past, and has done some policy learning from what has happened in Hungary, which is obviously something that people should observe, because that would be, that has some worrying trends. But I agree with everything that Dan said, and just to add 2 points to that. One is the bipartisan consensus on China, and the October 7th imposition of new sanctions on some high-end semiconductor IP, and the prohibition of U.S. nationals working on the maintenance of semiconductor equipment, is going to have an impact on allies, and that's going to have to be coordinated. But it is bipartisan. The other thing is, Dan mentioned the idea of reshoring and preserving and hardening the U.S. industrial base. I mean, there's nothing that Biden says with more relish, with more passion and fervor than, made in America, buy America, build America. So, I mean, that is definitely a reality that we're going to have to square, and that's going to make some difficult political decisions with our allies, including in Europe. But Europe has those same tendencies in some areas. So those are conversations that need to occur. There have been some breakthroughs on that area, in Boeing, Airbus, on tariffs on aluminum and steel, in other areas. So it is possible, but that's going to be a tough thing to watch in the next couple of years.
There's one more point that I'm going to add to the gentleman's points, both of them, which is that this is also a question of whether multilateralism versus bilateralism tends to be the preferred approach. Donald Trump kind of came out and tried to break the mold and say, I prefer bilateral relations, especially when it comes to trade. But even when it comes to any kind of security talks or whatever, he wanted even to deal with EU countries individually. And so many of them were like, it's not how it works. You have to kind of consult us as a bloc. But on China, that's the approach that he generally tried to take too, and quickly found out that didn't work, especially when he wanted to crack down on Huawei, and found that in order to do that in a real way, you needed Europe on board. And so, he kind of struggled with that. And you saw that completely reverse, even on China policy, with regard to the Biden administration, who very much wanted to embrace Europe. Kind of across the board, whether it was with NATO, whether it was on China policy. I mean, you just saw it in the last couple of days when Chancellor Olaf Scholz went to Beijing, and Biden was on the phone with him within hours to be like, what did he say? What did he say? We're expecting President Biden to obviously meet with Xi Jinping at the G20 in the coming days, and I'm sure that those calls will be reversed as well. And so you do see this kind of tight cooperation between European allies and the US on China policy. Whether or not Donald Trump's approach to kind of strict bilateralism was an anomaly or not, again, we'll see in the coming years when we have a presidential election. But that continues to be sort of the essence of how the US deals with Europe, and whether or not that flips or not is what I think is giving Europe a little bit of anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. Ambassador, did you want to hop in, or?
No, I think we've outlined the real policy tensions and tried to hold them up against the backdrop of the partisanship. And I want to circle back to Tyson's remark about Ron DeSantis and Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban, the strong man of Hungary, Orban is pro-Trump. He's a nationalist. He looks at Ukraine as an opportunity to carve out Hungarian national interests. It's pretty ugly stuff. For Republicans of a Trumpist ilk, Viktor Orban has been a model. I'm not sure that I'd like to think that Ron DeSantis is not all in, because Viktor Orban is also picking a losing side. You're tying yourself to he's tying himself to Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin started a war and he's not winning. And there are enough Reaganites in the Republican Party that the idea of a major, a candidate for president siding with Moscow over an issue of a war against a democracy is at least arguably a questionable position to have. Now, I'm hoping that Ron DeSantis, who's a smart man, understands this and moves in a Reaganite direction. But I can't say that he will. I'm just saying that this is, Rachel, you mentioned this at the very outset, there's going to be a drama within the Republican Party. And let's just remember, since I'm not only a policy wonk and an old bureaucrat, but someone who studied history, there were a lot of people on the right who hated before World War II, who hated Europe and were sort of on Hitler's side, sympathetic to the fascists. So, yeah, there's an ugly stream in this.
Yeah.
In American politics. It's our dark side, and it comes out occasionally. I don't think it'll prevail, but it never disappears.
Yeah. Tyson, I wanted to turn back to you for a second before we start to wrap up. We have a little less than 10 minutes left. There's, questions one question in the Q&A about Germany, and I wanted to touch on that a little bit. Germany has been the key ally for the United States in Europe and has gone through some immense changes over the last 8 months after Russia's invasion. Germany was also the focus of Trump's ire during his presidency. He had a special sort of disdain for Merkel. He harped on Germany for not spending enough on defense. And I do think there's this realization in Germany, it's even been coined with the word Zeitenwende, that we are living in a historical turning point, and Germany's role as a power in both Europe and around the world needs to sort of be recalibrated. How is Germany thinking about this election more specifically, and how are they expecting the relationship with the Biden administration to evolve over the next couple of years? Are they nervous about a return to a Trumpist-like candidate in 2024?
I think that is definitely something that you hear. I mean, if you meet with any German officials, elected officials, members of the Bundestag, many of whom have a very strong affinity to the United States, one of the worries that they will express is, yeah, the Biden administration is great, but how durable is this approach to Europe and the world? And what comes after this? And so a lot of their calibration vis-a-vis the United States, which is not related to the Zeitenwende, well, it is, but that's not its primary aim. Its primary focus has been to think about resilience strategies and diversification strategies, and that is something that has been consistent from the Merkel government to the current Scholz government. So that you hear Merkel say in her famous beer tent speech a couple of years ago, the time when we could rely on the United States for our security is somewhat, in the past. And so there is some thinking about that. But if you look at the kind of operational expenditures that Germany has started to outline as part of its special allotment of this 100 billion that it's spending, it demonstrates that the Germans are doubling down on NATO, on the U.S.-German defense relationship. And of course, the Biden administration has done the same by, reversing the troop withdrawal decision that the Trump administration that it had announced, by saying that the U.S. is going to deploy 500 more troops in Wiesbaden, specifically to deal with next generation issues like cyberspace and signals intelligence. It's still mixed. The other thing I would say is that Germany hasn't necessarily articulated what it means by Zeitenwende in all its kind of iterations and dimensions. And that's maybe a little bit worrying because the urgency isn't as acutely felt in Germany as it was in February and March. And that's not great because, proximity to Ukraine and proximity to Russia has a direct function in Europe on how dangerous and immediate and urgent this threat is felt. And so Germany is in some ways, even though we're going into winter, even though gas prices are going up, which has been cushioned by the German government by spending 200 billion to keep costs down, we're not seeing the kind of profound shift that I think many were hoping for when Scholz initially made that speech. I would also say, even though everybody recognizes, or most people recognize in Berlin, that it was a strategic mistake to bind their economic model so tightly to cheap Russian gas, which is now, hurting Germany's industrial base and really putting the German manufacturing production model at risk. The answer to that by the Germans has been to shore up consumer markets in China with all sorts of kind of political second and third order impacts. And I think that could be a source, and has been a source, of discussion and perhaps future tension, not only between Germany and the United States, but also with other European partners. I mean, this is not a moment, I have to say, when Germany has the best relations with all its neighbors. There are tensions with France, there are tensions with Central Europe and the Balts, and there are tensions with the EU. And the United States, ironically, is one of Germany's most stable relationships currently. But, getting the Germans to recognize that this is really a moment to invest in that relationship by lifting up their role within NATO and also within the EU is something that I think the next government, or the Congress and the Biden administration continuing, needs to continue to emphasize.
Perfect. Yes. Okay, so we have about 3 minutes left. So I want to turn to Vivian and then Ambassador Freed to close this out. And now that the midterms are over, we are going to shift very quickly into another presidential cycle, especially if Trump decides to announce his candidacy for president, as he has hinted that he might do on November 15th. So looking forward to having that rhetoric back into the general conversation. But I'm wondering, Vivian, do the results of this race, do you think, indicate whether either party seems to have more momentum as we shift into the presidential race? And how do you think Europe should be thinking about this over the next couple of years?
That's always a possibility, obviously, and that's a lot of people kind of take away from the midterms what the next 2 years would be like, and certainly the upcoming presidential election. Both President Biden, who yesterday gave a press conference, he said that he still kind of, intends to run, but he still wants to talk it over with his wife, but said that the elections, the results of the elections wouldn't have sway his decision either way. Donald Trump said the same thing, that, despite the fact that it wasn't the wave, he said that, he thought that the Republicans did very well and it wouldn't really influence him. And so the competition is on. There's a lot of questions, obviously, about the candidates that former President Trump supported, and whether the fact that several of them did not win, does that kind of weaken his position, especially when you have a rising figure like Ron DeSantis within the party, who's going to likely take him on. and a number of others, but DeSantis seems to be the other leading figure, if that's going to really make the Republican contest something to watch, or whether or not Donald Trump will just have like a blowout victory. All of that is to say that you have in the backdrop questions about whether President Biden not only will run, because he seems to indicate he will, but whether or not he should run. A lot of concern, he's going to be 80 next year, and there's a lot of concern about his age and whether or not he has the physical and mental fitness needed to proceed just because of his age. He insists that he's feeling great and going to proceed. And so we'll see how that goes. Obviously for Europe, the immediate impact will be what the policies out of the White House, what the policies out of Congress are. So we've covered that in extensive depth. But I would say just in terms of, where we go from here, I suppose watch the language from the Republican Party in particular, because Ron DeSantis still hasn't really put himself on the map as far as his foreign policy. He's hinted at a few things here and there, but he's been largely focused at, his home state of Florida. We'll see how he takes things and whether or not we're going to see again an abrupt shift in the coming years if he were to kind of rise as the nominee.
Thank you. Ambassador Fried, any closing thoughts?
A week ago, there was a lot of talk about American democracy being in trouble, which I understand because of the authoritarian wing of the Republican Party, the election deniers, and Donald Trump. Nobody's talking about that now. It was a good day for democracy. So that's one big deal. Some of the authoritarians, the sort of people committed to election denialism in the Republican Party didn't do so well. That's really important. Secondly, we've returned, and we've discussed this throughout the hour, to a tension between America's role in the world and what that means, China, Europe, balancing different interests and values, a tension between that and American priorities at home, bread and butter issues. American presidents ever since Roosevelt and Truman have been challenged sometimes to explain to the American people what the stakes are, why America's role in the world is important to prosperity at home. That challenge hasn't changed. It's not going away. Biden understands this. He's 10 years older than I am, and many disadvantages to that, but one advantage is he knows these issues in his bones. So it's a pretty good moment, actually. Our politics, we're down to all these issues that we would have been discussing 10 or 15 years ago, sort of in new form. But that's not a bad thing, considering the dire predictions a week ago. The American electoral system worked pretty well. The extremists, the armed gangs didn't make much of a difference. So not bad. Let me close with a thought from William Seward, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. There was always just enough virtue in this republic to save it. Sometimes none to spare, but still enough to meet the emergency.
I can't think of a better quote to end this event on. Thank you so much for that and for your thoughts. This has been an incredibly rich discussion. I look forward to having more of these as we move deeper into the Biden administration and start having discussions about the presidential run in 2024. So a lot to expect, a lot happening. Thank you, Ambassador Fried. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Tyson. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks a lot, everyone.